There's a whisper beneath the world, an ancient breath that sometimes catches, just for a moment, making the pines shiver with a sound beyond wind. Have you ever stood on hallowed ground, felt the immense quiet, and understood, truly understood, that you're merely a visitor on a vast, dreaming entity? We build our coffee shops and our tech startups, our bustling cities, upon a thin, fragile skin, oblivious to the heart beating beneath. A heart that, for millennia, has just slept. But what if the dream ends? What if that deep, slow rhythm falters, then changes into something else entirely? What if the earth decides to wake, not with a roar, but with a sorrowful, inevitable sigh? We cling to our fragile certainties, but some truths are carved in molten rock and ash, waiting to rewrite everything we know, not with anger, but with an ancient, quiet finality. The morning light, filtered through the thick canopy of ponderosa pines, painted shifting patterns on Ilara's cabin floor. It was a pale, hesitant gold, promising warmth that the crisp mountain air still denied. She breathed it in, this cold, clean scent of pine needles and damp earth, a familiar balm that usually settled her soul. But today, a faint tremor ran beneath it. A discord in the forest's quiet symphony. Ilara had woken before dawn, as she often did, not to an alarm, but to an inner clock calibrated by the sun and the subtle shifts of the wildland just beyond her doorstep. Her cabin, nestled on the fringes of Yellowstone, was more a meditation space than a dwelling, its rough-hewn timbers and large east-facing window blurring the lines between indoors and out. She moved slowly, deliberately, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden planks. The ritual was always the same. Grind coffee beans by hand, the rhythmic whir a comforting drone, then boil water in a dented copper kettle. As the dark liquid bloomed in her mug, fragrant and steaming, she walked to the window. Beyond the panes, the ancient landscape stretched, a tapestry of greens and grays under a sky still bruised with lingering night. Far off, a plume of steam, faint and ethereal, rose against the horizon, a breath from the earth itself. It was Yellowstone, a presence both visible and felt, a colossal, sleeping heart beneath the thin skin of the world. Ilara was an artist. Her studio, nothing more than a corner of her living room, where canvases leaned against the wall like silent observers. Her subject was always this land, the ephemeral dance of light on a mountain peak, the intricate patterns of lichen on rock, the quiet strength of an old-growth tree. She tried to capture the feeling of things, the resonance of ancient quiet. Her latest piece, a large acrylic painting, depicted a stand of lodgepole pines, their needles 1,000 shades of emerald and jade. But as she sipped her coffee, her gaze fell upon it, and a flicker of unease caught in her chest. The pines, usually so steadfast in her memory, now seemed to lean, their forms slightly askew, as if a silent wind had pushed them just so. A subtle, almost imperceptible crack had begun to form in the painted ground beneath them. A hairline fracture she hadn't consciously intended. She touched her fingers to the cool glass of the window pane, feeling a slight vibration. It wasn't strong enough to rattle the mug on the sill, but it was there, a deep, persistent hum that seemed to resonate more in her bones than in her ears. It was like a memory of a sound, rather than the sound itself, or perhaps a premonition. She tried to shake it off, dismissing it as the distant rumble of a passing logging truck, though she knew no such vehicles traversed this isolated road so early. The hum faded, or perhaps she simply grew accustomed to it, a persistent whisper at the edge of her hearing. Deciding a walk was needed, Elara pulled on sturdy boots and a worn flannel shirt, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The forest floor was soft beneath her feet, yielding slightly with each step, a rich bed of fallen pine needles and decaying leaves. A squirrel chattered furiously from a high branch, its tiny, agitated movements a stark contrast to the usual calm of the woodland creatures she observed. She found herself on a narrow trail, barely a deer path, leading deeper into the woods, away from the distant roads, towards the more untouched parts of the park's immense periphery. Here, the air tasted even cleaner, almost mineral. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of her boots and the occasional unsettling stillness of the birds. Normally, the forest was alive with birdsong, a constant chatter and flurry of wings. Today, it felt muted, hushed, as if the creatures themselves were holding their breath. She stopped by a small stream, its water clear and cold, bubbling over smooth stones. As she knelt, dipping her fingers into the icy flow, a strange, faint scent reached her nostrils. It wasn't sulfur, not exactly, but something metallic, acrid, like pennies left in the rain, mixed with a deeper, earthy tang that spoke of unimaginable depth. A shiver traced its way up her spine, not from the cold water, but from an intuitive dread. She closed her eyes, and suddenly, the familiar woods shifted. The vision was fleeting, dreamlike, a whisper behind her eyelids. She saw not the stream, but a river of boiling mud, bubbling and spitting, reflecting a sky the color of bruised plums. The trees were gone, replaced by skeletal forms, stark against the monochrome landscape. The earth itself seemed to heave, a slow, viscous undulation, like a giant animal stirring from a slumber far too long. A deep, vibrating thrum resonated through her entire body, a sensation of immense pressure building, then slowly, agonizingly, releasing. It was not violent, not a sudden explosion, but a profound, sorrowful exhalation, as if the world was sighing its last breath. The metallic scent intensified, filling her lungs, sharp and suffocating. She gasped, her eyes flying open. The stream gurgled softly before her, utterly unchanged, its water crystal clear. The pines stood tall and green, swaying gently in a breeze that carried only the scent of pine. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the quietude. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself to her feet. It had felt so real, more than just a passing thought, more than a memory. It felt like a future, seen through a glass darkly. She walked back to her cabin, the hum in her bones more pronounced now, a subtle ache that made her shoulders tense. The premonition hadn't been a warning of rage or fury, but of something far more unsettling, a profound, inevitable sadness. It was the earth weeping, perhaps. Back in her studio, the half-finished painting of the pines seemed to mock her, its tranquil facade hiding the truth that her inner eye had glimpsed. She picked up a thin brush, her hand hovering over the canvas. How could she paint this feeling, this pervasive sense of an ancient quiet beginning to stir, not with a roar, but with a deep existential unease? The sun dipped lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the forest. The air grew cooler, carrying the promise of a sharp evening frost. From her window, she watched the distant steam plume of Yellowstone, now catching the last rays of the sun, glowing a faint, spectral orange. It seemed to pulse, ever so slightly, with the rhythm of her own frantic heart. Elara didn't know what it meant, not fully. She couldn't articulate the feeling, couldn't give it a name beyond a pervasive, whispering dread. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the deep, slow rhythm beneath the world was changing. The dream was ending, and the earth, it seemed, was beginning to sigh. The early morning light, thin and hesitant, spilled across the worn floorboards of Ilara's cabin. It tasted of pine needles and damp earth, a familiar comfort she had cultivated over years. She sat by the window, a steaming mug of black tea warming her palms, watching the forest awaken. A shiver, not of cold but of something ancient stirring, traced its way up her spine. It was always there, a low, thrumming whisper beneath the soles of her bare feet, a resonance she felt more than heard. Most mornings it was a distant murmur, like a deep sleeper breathing. Today, however, the whisper felt closer, a faint, insistent vibration that buzzed in her teeth. She pressed her bare feet firmer against the cool wood, as if trying to ground herself, to anchor the elusive tremor. A deep furrow settled between her brows. It wasn't a sound, not really, but a feeling, a pressure against her eardrums, a reverberation in her bones. She'd tried to explain it once, years ago, to a friend from the city. The friend had laughed gently, suggesting it was just the silence of the woods, or perhaps the ringing of an old bell in Ilara's own mind. Ilara had smiled, nodded, and retreated into her own quiet understanding. Some things, she knew, were meant to be felt alone, out in the wider world, far from Ilara's secluded hollow. The screens glowed with green lines and digital data. In regional observatories, tucked away in air-conditioned rooms, technicians stared at the readouts. Another little bump, one man grumbled, chewing on the end of his pen. Looks like a 2.1 near the caldera. His colleague, a woman with tired eyes and a perpetually worried expression, zoomed in on the anomaly. Unusual frequency, wouldn't you say? For this time of year, she murmured, more to herself than him. He shrugged, already turning back to his coffee. Yellowstone breathes. It always has. Probably just a hydrothermal tremor or some minor fault slip. Happens all the time. Still, she began, tracing a pattern with her finger on the screen. The periodicity is a little off, more sustained than typical. He waved a dismissive hand. Report it as routine. Don't cause a fuss. We've got bigger things to worry about, like funding cuts. Her lips thinned, but she logged the data, tagged it as minor, routine seismic activity, and moved on. The world, it seemed, was too busy with its own rhythms to notice the fainter, deeper beat. Ilara, meanwhile, found herself drawn out into the forest. The hum pulsed with a slightly increased urgency now, an almost imperceptible quickening of tempo. She walked silently, her senses peeled back like petals opening to the sun. The usual morning chorus of birds was muted. Only a few chirps here and there, strangely hesitant, broke the profound stillness. A flock of finches, usually a riot of chatter and darting movement, sat huddled on a low branch, their tiny heads cocked, their beady eyes unnervingly still. They looked, to Ilara's keen perception, like creatures listening for something only they could hear. She watched a squirrel, notorious for its frantic energy, pause mid-scamper up an oak, its bushy tail rigid, its nose twitching rapid. It didn't seem to be sniffing for food, but rather for some distant scent that Ilara couldn't detect. Then, with a sudden panicked flick, it dropped its acorn and vanished into the undergrowth. A knot tightened in Ilara's stomach. Animals, she knew, were the Earth's truest prophets. They felt the subtle shifts, the minute tremors, long before human instruments registered them. long before the conscious mind even entertained the possibility. She thought of the migration patterns of the deer, how they seemed to be drifting further south this year, weeks ahead of schedule. Or the bears, usually fat and sluggish by late summer, but now unusually lean, their movements sharper, more agitated. It was a quiet language, this animal anxiety, a tapestry woven of instinct and survival. And it was humming in unison with the vibration beneath her feet. She wandered towards her small herb garden, a place of peace and familiar order. But even here, the earth seemed to be playing an unfamiliar tune. The rosemary, usually a modest shrub, had burst forth in an astonishing bloom of purple flowers weeks too early. Its scent, usually sharp and clean, now carried an almost cloying sweetness, as if overdosed on vitality. Her sage plants were nearly twice their usual size, their leaves an improbable, almost violent shade of silvery green. And the dandelion, normally a nuisance she tolerated, they had erupted everywhere, their golden heads enormous, almost grotesque in their perfect, exuberant circles. They pulsed with a vibrancy that felt unnatural, aggressive even. It was growth, yes, but it was too much, too fast, too loud in its silent assertion. She knelt, her fingers brushing against a dandelion stem, feeling the strange tautness of it, the almost feverish energy radiating from its petals. The hum felt stronger here, closer to the surface, as if the very soil was vibrating with an intense, unseen force. She closed her eyes, trying to separate the hum from the blood rushing in her ears, from the insistent thrum of her own heartbeat. But they were intertwined, the hum and her own growing disquiet. It was not a destructive force, not yet. It felt more like an accelerated awakening, a profound surge of life, but with an underlying current of something profoundly sorrowful, something inevitable, like a dream ending, not with a jolt, but with a slow, mournful exhale. Ilara spent the rest of the day in a contemplative silence, the subtle vibrations never truly leaving her. She ate her simple supper of broth and homemade bread, but the food felt like ash in her mouth. The quiet of the cabin, usually a soothing balm, now seemed to amplify the internal hum, making her feel oddly isolated, a solitary receiver of a message no one else seemed to perceive. She thought of the dismissive shrug of the technician, the routine reports. How easy it was for people to categorize, to explain away, to reduce the vast, unknowable mysteries of the earth to a mere statistic. But what if the earth wasn't a statistic? What if it was a living, breathing entity with its own pains and dreams? And what if, after millennia of slumber, it was finally stirring, not in anger, but in a profound, quiet preparation? The thought settled heavily in her chest, a leaden weight. She rose and walked to the window again, looking out at the deepening twilight. The forest was still, perhaps too still. A single owl hooted, its call echoing mournfully through the trees. The hum beneath her feet was no longer just a whisper. It was a deepening chord, a resonant frequency that spoke of change, of an awakening that promised to rewrite the very definition of routine. Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, a silent plea against the coming unknown. She could feel it, a vast, patient breath drawing in deep beneath the world. And she was afraid, not with a shout, but with a quiet, sorrowful knowing. The dream, she felt, was ending, and she was the only one awake to hear the earth's first sigh. The air in the small cabin always held a ghost of pine and damp earth, a comfort that Ilara usually found deeply soothing. Tonight, it felt suffocating. She sat by the window, watching the last slivers of apricot light bleed out from behind the jagged tree line. The silence was immense here, a vast breathing thing, yet she could hear it, not with her ears, but somewhere deeper, a low hum beneath the floorboards. A tremor, she swore, vibrated through her bones. It had been growing, this subtle thrum, for weeks now. At first, it was just a fleeting unease, a shiver that ran through her when she walked near one of the smaller, less frequented geysers. Then, it started following her home. Liam, ever the pragmatist, was humming a low tune in the kitchen, clinking cutlery as he laid the table for dinner. The cheerful sound felt like a foreign language in the dense quiet of Ilara's mind. She turned from the window, pulling the soft wool cardigan tighter around her. Liam, her voice felt small, tentative, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something fragile in the air. He poked his head out from the kitchen, a smile playing on his lips, a smudge of flour on his cheek. He had been attempting his grandmother's biscuit recipe again, a ritual that usually brought a sense of grounded warmth to their evening. "Hey, sleepyhead, nearly ready. Just finishing up the stew." His eyes, usually bright with a kind of restless scientific curiosity, softened when they met hers. "What is it?" he asked, noticing the subtle tension in her shoulders. Ilara hesitated, wrapping her fingers around the cool ceramic mug in her hands. How could she explain the feeling of the earth itself sighing? A profound, heavy exhalation that resonated within her own chest. It's the ground," she began, the words stumbling. "I can feel it, Liam. A kind of pulse. It's stronger now, more insistent." Liam's smile didn't falter, but a faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his gaze, a flicker of that familiar analytical gleam. He walked over to her, his movements easy and confident, smelling faintly of garlic and pine. He placed a warm hand on her forehead, his touch comforting, but laced with a subtle hint of medical assessment. "No fever, love," he murmured, his thumb gently brushing her temple. "Are you sure you're not just a little overtired? You've been spending a lot of time out by yourself lately." Sketching. She pulled back slightly, a quiet sigh escaping her. "It's not tiredness, it's real, like a very low vibration. It feels heavy." He paused, his brow furrowing slightly, but still with that patient, indulgent expression that always made her feel like a fanciful child. "Heavy, huh?" He turned and walked back to the kitchen, stirring the stew with a practiced hand. "I understand you're feeling something, Ilara, but our seismic sensors aren't picking up anything unusual. No new swarms, no significant uplift or subsidence that isn't already within the expected parameters. Yellowstone is always breathing, always shifting. That's just how it is." The rich aroma of savory herbs and slow-cooked beef wafted from the pot, a homey scent that felt jarring against the unsettling whisper in her bones. She wanted to scream, to make him understand that her sensitivity wasn't some romanticized intuition, but a stark, undeniable awareness. Instead, a familiar weariness settled over her. She watched him, the strong line of his back, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and a wave of sorrow washed over her. He was so grounded, so utterly tethered to what could be measured, recorded, graphed, and she was drifting. "It feels different, Liam." She tried again, her voice softer now, almost a plea. "Not like the usual breathing." It's mournful, like a deep sadness. He turned from the stove, a small, kind smile on his face, but his eyes held a subtle exasperation she knew too well. Mournful, darling? The earth doesn't feel things in that way. It's a collection of geological processes, forces of nature. It's beautiful, yes, awe-inspiring, but it doesn't have emotions. He walked back to the window, peering out at the deepening twilight, as if seeking a scientific explanation in the shadows. Sometimes when you spend so much time alone, letting your imagination wander, well, the mind can play tricks. Especially in a place like this, full of ancient power. His words, meant to soothe, felt like a cold stone pressed against her heart. She had always valued his practicality, his ability to dissect complex problems into understandable components. But now, that very quality felt like an impenetrable wall between them. He was dismissing her, not unkindly, but thoroughly. Dinner was a quiet affair. The clinking of their forks against the ceramic bowls was the loudest sound. Liam talked about his day, about a tricky rock formation he'd been examining, about a new paper he was reading on Mantelplume. Elara nodded, offering monosyllabic responses, her mind elsewhere. The stew, usually a comforting ritual, tasted bland. She kept feeling the subtle tremor in the floor, in the wooden legs of her chair, a sensation that made her teeth ache. Every now and then, she would catch Liam glancing at her, a worried crease forming between his brows, but he said nothing more about her feelings. Later, as they prepared for bed, the unspoken tension thickened the air between them. Liam hummed softly as he brushed his teeth, his routine a bulwark against the unsettling silence. Elara watched him from the doorway, a hollow ache growing within her. She yearned for him to just feel it, even for a moment, to validate her experience. She wanted to tell him how the very air felt thinner, how the familiar scent of the pines now carried an almost metallic tang, like distant static. But she knew the words would fall on scientific, deaf ears. In bed, Liam pulled her close, his arms strong and reassuring. She nestled into his warmth, seeking solace, but even his embrace couldn't quiet the growing unease. His breathing was slow, even. He was already drifting. Her eyes remained wide open in the darkness, staring at the faint outline of the window against the deeper black of the night sky. The cabin creaked, the wind whispered through the eaves, and beneath it all, the earth thrummed, a steady, low pulse that vibrated deep within her. It felt like a heartbeat, heavy and profound, but also slowing or changing rhythm. It wasn't a roar she heard, but a sorrowful sigh, a vast, ancient groan that only she seemed to perceive. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracing a warm path down her temple into her hair. She thought back to simpler times, to their first summer here, when the earth felt like a playful giant, full of wonder and discovery. Liam had laughed then, his arm around her, as they watched a bison herd graze against the backdrop of a steaming pool. He had shared her awe, if not her deeper, more intuitive connection. Now his awe was strictly intellectual, categorized, measured. Her connection felt like a burden, a solitary truth. The next morning, the air was crisp, brilliant, almost painfully clear. Sunlight poured into their small living room, highlighting dust motes dancing in the beams. Liam was already at the breakfast table, engrossed in a geological journal, a mug of steaming coffee beside him. "Morning, love," he said, not looking up immediately. "Sleep well?" Alara felt a bitter twist in her stomach. "Fine," she lied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The dark liquid smelled strong, bitter. She watched him, his profile silhouetted against the window, the strong line of his jaw. He looked so solid, so unshakable. "I was thinking," she began, the words careful, chosen, "about the anomaly." He finally looked up, his expression guarded now, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Alara, we've talked about this. There's no anomaly? Perhaps you could take a few days off, visit your sister in Denver, get a change of scenery?" His suggestion, meant with kindness, felt like a deliberate attempt to remove her from the source of her delusion. It was a well-intentioned dismissal, a gentle push away from her truth. A hot flush crept up her neck, and she clenched her fists under the table until her knuckles were white. She took a deep, shaky breath, pushing down the surge of frustration. "I'm not imagining things, Liam," she said, her voice low, trembling slightly with controlled emotion. "And I don't need a vacation from my own mind." He sighed, a long, tired sound, and closed his journal, placing it carefully on the table. He reached across, taking her hand. His touch was warm, reassuring, but felt strangely distant. "I just worry about you," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You're so sensitive, Alara. This place, it can get into your head. It's immense, primal. But that doesn't mean it's communicating with you on an emotional level." She pulled her hand away gently, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her coffee cup. "Maybe it communicates in ways you haven't learned to measure yet." The words hung in the air, a chasm opening between them. He looked at her, his lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of hurt and disbelief in his eyes. "There are no unmeasurable communications in geology, Alara. There are only things we haven't developed the right instruments for yet, but we always will." Eventually, his certainty, once a comfort, now felt like a cage. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. "Perhaps," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "perhaps the instruments aren't the only things that need developing." She walked to the window again, looking out at the endless expanse of pine, steam, and distant mountains. The sun was higher now, blazing, but its warmth didn't reach her. The subtle hum was still there, beneath everything. A constant, undeniable presence. She knew, with a certainty that transcended data and instruments, that something profound was stirring. And if Liam, with all his scientific understanding, couldn't or wouldn't see it, then she would have to look elsewhere. The earth was speaking, not roaring, but whispering a truth only she could hear. And she had to understand. She had to find a way to listen, truly listen, even if it meant stepping into the unknown, beyond the boundaries of Liam's carefully constructed, scientific world. A profound sense of solitude settled upon her, heavy and cold, yet strangely liberating. She was alone in this, she realized, but she was not wrong. The deep, quiet finality she felt wasn't just in the earth, but in her own resolve. The steam had always been a performance, a grand, theatrical exhale from the earth's ancient lungs. Now, it felt like a stifled gasp. Alara stood at the edge of the Norris Geyser Basin, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and wet earth, a familiar bouquet that had begun to carry an unsettling undertone. A note of desperation she couldn't quite name. The mud pots, usually a gentle, rhythmic boil, had become agitated, their gray surfaces roiling with a furious energy that splattered the boardwalk with hot, viscous mud. She watched a particular pool, normally a placid turquoise eye, now bubbling erratically, spitting small, hot stones onto the brittle, mineral-encrusted ground. A low, rumbling groan, deeper than any she'd heard before, vibrated through the soles of her hiking boots. It wasn't a sound from the sky or from passing traffic. It was a resonance from beneath, a bass note played by an invisible, colossal instrument. Park visitors, though fewer than usual, still strolled past with wide-eyed wonder, their faces reflecting the pale glow of the hot springs, their cameras clicking. They saw a spectacle. Ilara saw a tremor in the Earth's composure, a subtle, sorrowful shift. Just yesterday, the official park bulletin had reaffirmed the stability of the geothermal activity, calling the intensified displays a natural phase within the dynamic ecosystem. The words felt thin, transparent, like the film of ice on a boiling pond. She remembered the warmth of her coffee cup that morning, the comforting weight of it. But even that small solace had been tainted by a dull ache behind her eyes, a premonition that clung to her like the sulphurous mist. A cold sweat prickled her scalp, despite the warmth rising from the ground. For weeks now, she had documented the subtle changes, initially dismissed as scientific anomalies or seasonal variation. The sudden, unexplained emptying of small thermal pools. The bizarre coloration shifts in some of the hot springs, from sapphire blues to an unsettling, murky ochre. The unusual tremors, often too faint to register on official seismographs, yet distinct enough for her to feel in the quiet hours of dawn, a faint shiver through the bedrock that left her feeling profoundly unsettled. She had tried to convey her growing alarm to colleagues, to park officials, but her observations were met with polite skepticism, sometimes even a patronizing smile. "Ilara, the park is always changing," one had said, his voice laced with a weary patience. "Yellowstone breathes." But this was different. This wasn't a breath. It was a holding of breath, followed by a series of frantic, shallow gasps. The smell of ozone grew stronger, sharp and metallic, like the air before a lightning storm. She knew, deep in the hollow space between her ribs, that something ancient was stirring, waking with a slow, agonizing stretch. Her gaze drifted to the distant pines, their needles dark green against a sky that felt too bright, too indifferent. A lone raven circled high above, its call a ragged cry that seemed to carry the weight of untold stories. The feeling of isolation pressed down on her, a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. Who would believe her? Who would see past the official reassurance and hear the Earth's quiet lament, driven by an instinct she couldn't articulate? Ilara left the crowded boardwalk, following a less traveled path that meandered towards the quieter, northern reaches of the park. She walked for what felt like hours, the sounds of her own footsteps on the dusty trail, a rhythmic counterpoint to the insistent rumble beneath the earth. The air grew cooler as she moved away from the main thermal areas, the sulphurous tang fading, replaced by the crisp, clean scent of pine and damp soil. The path eventually led her to a small, unassuming general store and gas station, a place she hadn't known existed. It looked as if time had forgotten it, its wooden porch weathered and its paint peeling. A single, ancient pickup truck was parked outside, its tires caked with red dirt. Hesitantly, she pushed open the screen door. A bell above her head jingled softly, a sound that felt out of place in the growing quietude of the park. The interior was dimly lit, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and something else. Dried herbs, perhaps, or old leather. Rows of basic supplies lined the shelves, alongside handcrafted items. Beaded jewelry, small carved animal totems, bundles of fragrant sage. Behind the counter, a man sat on a worn stool, meticulously whittling a small piece of wood. He was old, his face a roadmap of fine lines and sun-weathered creases, his silver hair pulled back into a neat braid that rested on his shoulder. His eyes, the color of dark river stones, held a depth that made Alara feel, for a fleeting moment, as if he could see right through her, into the core of her anxieties. He didn't look up immediately, his hands continuing their steady, precise work. The silence stretched, not awkward, but expectant, like the quiet before a shared secret. "Can I help you, young woman?" he asked finally, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle, like stones tumbling in a stream. Alara cleared her throat, suddenly feeling self-conscious, her carefully constructed scientific observations sounding almost absurd in this serene space. I was just driving by," she began, the lie tasting sour on her tongue. "I work as a geologist in the park." He nodded slowly, still not looking up, but she felt his attention sharpen. "Things are changing," she blurted out, unable to hold back the torrent of her observations any longer. "The mud pots, the springs, the rumbling. It's beyond normal variations. It feels different. Deeper." She described the erratic boiling, the strange color shifts, the unsettling tremors, the persistent, low hum that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. She spoke with a hurried intensity, her hands gesturing slightly, her voice rising with the urgency of her conviction. When she finished, the only sound was the faint scraping of his whittling knife against the wood. He finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers, and a flicker of something passed between them. Not disbelief, but recognition. A shared understanding that settled like warm embers in Alara's chest. "The earth has always spoken," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, as if he were sharing a sacred trust. "We, her children, have merely forgotten how to listen." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the small, dusty window, as if looking beyond the glass into the heart of the forest. "My name is Silas," he offered. "My people have listened to this land for generations beyond counting." "Alara," she replied, her voice barely audible. You've noticed it too?" she asked, the question laced with a desperate hope. Silas slowly placed his half-finished carving on the counter, his hands, gnarled and strong, resting there. "The old stories speak of a time when the earth's heart stirs," he began, his voice taking on a resonant quality that seemed to echo through the small store. Not in anger, necessarily, but in remembrance. A shifting, a turning, a settling of ancient bones. He looked at her again, his eyes holding a profound sorrow. "The omens you describe, young Alara, they are not new to us. The waters turning sour, the ground singing a low song, the trees whispering secrets no human ear was meant to hear." A wave of relief, so potent it made her knees feel weak, washed over Alara. It wasn't just her. She wasn't alone in hearing the earth's sorrowful sigh. Silas nodded, as if sensing her inner turmoil, a faint, knowing smile gracing his lips. "You have eyes that see beyond the surface, and ears that hear the deeper currents," he said, his words a balm to her frayed nerve. "That is a rare gift and a heavy burden." The weight of her anxieties hadn't vanished, but now a part of it felt shared. A quiet, unexpected alliance had been forged in the stillness of that small, forgotten store, under the watchful gaze of an elder who understood the earth's ancient language. The air outside, though still carrying the distant rumble, felt less suffocating. For the first time in weeks, Alara didn't feel completely alone in her dread. She had found someone who heard the whisper, and perhaps together they might learn what it was trying to say. The hum of the road beneath their tires had begun to feel less like a promise of travel and more like a low thrum of anxiety, a vibration that echoed the news trickling in from outside the park's invisible boundary. Ilara traced the condensation on her window with a slow finger, watching the blurred pine forests give way to small towns where the usual summer bustle had withered into a tense stillness. Every gas station they passed had a television mounted above the counter, its muted screen flashing maps with expanding red zones, overlaid with graphs spiking sharply upwards. The cashier at the last convenience store, a woman with tired eyes and a faint tremor in her hands, had mumbled something about the springs near her cousin's cabin, turning a strange, milky white. She hadn't met Ilara's gaze. Silas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He'd been quieter than usual, the easy cadence of his thoughts replaced by a steady, almost imperceptible frown. His scientific mind, usually a fortress of logic, seemed besieged by the illogical nature of what was unfolding. He downloaded every seismic update, every gas emission report, but the numbers were becoming too large, too frequent, to fit into neat equations. "Do you think they know?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper against the low rumble of the engine. "Know what, exactly?" Silas countered, his voice flat, not looking away from the winding road. "That it's not just the park anymore." She paused, then added, "that it's us." Silas sighed, a slow, heavy exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of distant mountains. "They're reporting it, aren't they? But do they feel it?" She pressed, turning in her seat to face him, her eyes wide, reflecting the dappled light filtering through the canopy. "The way the air tastes different, like old pennies and something else. Something ancient?" He didn't respond, but a faint tremor ran through his jaw, a telltale sign of his own unease. They drove deeper, past the entrance gates that now stood eerily deserted, past the usual overlooks where tourists once jostled for photos. The asphalt gave way to a gravel track, then little more than a pair of faint ruts winding through dense undergrowth. This was a different Yellowstone, far from the well-trodden path. The air grew cooler here, touched with the damp scent of rich earth and decaying leaves, overlaid with the ever-present, subtle metallic tang that Ilara had come to associate with the sleeping giant beneath them. Silas consulted a worn topographical map, its creases softened by years of use, a compass glinting briefly in his hand. "The old Sean trails," he murmured, more to himself than to Ilara. "The ones that led to the whispering pools." Ilara remembered the stories, snippets from dusty anthropological texts she devoured. Places where the earth was said to breathe, where ancient spirits lingered, offering guidance not through words, but through feeling. A path forward, she hoped, might lie in looking backward, in listening to echoes long forgotten. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and faded gold. A canvas of quiet sorrow. They finally parked the old Ford Ranger near a tangle of gnarled lodgepole pines, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers towards the heavens. The silence that enveloped them was profound, broken only by the distant hypnotic rush of a waterfall they couldn't see, and the gentle sigh of the wind through the needles. The air here felt thick, almost viscous, carrying the scent of damp moss, resin, and something else. A faint, unidentifiable warmth, like breath on a cold window pane. They walked, Ilara leading, her steps light and deliberate, Silas following close behind, his boots crunching softly on the fallen leaf. They navigated around enormous, moss-covered boulders, their surfaces slick with moisture, past groves of aspens whose leaves trembled with a perpetual silver rustle. The path, barely discernible, descended gradually, growing darker and more enclosed as the trees pressed in around them. Suddenly, Elara stopped. Ahead, through a parting in the dense foliage, lay a clearing. It wasn't large, perhaps 50 feet across, but its presence felt monumental. At its center was a cluster of hot springs, not the vibrant, colorful thermal pools of the main caldera, but shallow, milky depressions, their surfaces almost perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky like smoky mirror. Steam rose from them in languid, silent tendrils, weaving through the ancient trees that ringed the clearing. The trees themselves were different here. Their bark was rougher, deeper ridged, and many bore faint, almost indistinguishable carvings, spirals, concentric circles, lines that seemed to mimic the patterns of the geysers. They were not aggressive or obvious, but rather absorbed into the very grain of the wood, as if the trees had grown around the markings, protecting them. Whispering pools, Elara breathed, the words barely audible. Silas stepped up beside her, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He knelt, running his hand over a patch of warm earth at the edge of the clearing. "The temperature gradient is unusually high here," he murmured, his scientific curiosity momentarily surfacing through his apprehension. "And the gas readings. There's a distinct hydrogen sulfide note, but also something else, fainter, perhaps methane." He pulled a small battered field journal from his pack, his pen poised. Elara, however, felt no inclination to measure or quantify. She walked slowly towards the pools, her steps cautious, as if approaching a sacred altar. The ground beneath her moccasins felt strangely alive, a subtle vibration rising through the soles of her feet, connecting her directly to the earth's pulse. She reached the edge of the largest pool, its surface perfectly calm, reflecting the twilight. It wasn't just water. It felt like liquid silence. She knelt, extending a hand, but not quite touching the surface. A faint warmth emanated from it, not harsh, but a comforting, ancient heat. "What do you feel?" Silas asked, his voice softer now, his journal forgotten on the ground beside him. Elara closed her eyes, letting the stillness seep into her bones. "It's not angry," she whispered, her own voice sounding alien in the profound quiet. "It's deeply, profoundly sad." She opened her eyes, looking at the carved trees, at the steam rising like the earth's own mournful breath. "It feels like a sigh, Silas." "A sigh of what?" he asked, moving closer, his own pragmatic mind struggling to grasp her intuition. "Of knowing," she replied, her gaze fixed on the endless depths of the milky pool. "Of a terrible, inevitable knowing." She leaned in, closer to the water, as if trying to hear an unspoken confession. The carvings on the trees she now saw were not just patterns. They were a language, a forgotten script whispering tales of cyclical destruction and renewal. She saw a spiraling descent, then a slow, arduous ascent, then the descent again. An endless loop, carved not by human hands, but by the very forces of the earth, echoing through the wood. "It's not a warning," she murmured, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It's a eulogy." Silas stood beside her, his hand gently finding her shoulder. He looked from the carved trees to the still, steaming pools, then to the darkening sky, which seemed to press down with an immense, quiet weight. He felt the vibration too, now, a low, persistent thrum beneath his feet, reaching up his legs, into his chest. It wasn't the tremor of an earthquake, but the deep, resonant heartbeat of something vast and ancient, stirring from a long, troubled dream. There was no sudden revelation, no grand pronouncement, only the quiet acceptance of a truth that had been patiently waiting for them in this forgotten corner of the world. The path forward, they realized, might not be one of escape or avoidance, but of quiet reverence, of bearing witness. The night deepened, wrapping the clearing in a cloak of profound silence, punctuated only by the earth's soft, sorrowful breath. They remained there, Elara and Silas, two small figures in a vast, awakening world, listening to the whispered wisdom of the earth. The stars, when they finally appeared through the breaks in the canopy, seemed impossibly bright, like a million tiny tears scattered across the heavens. They were witnesses now to the slow, inevitable unfolding of a story older than humanity itself. And the earth, beneath them, continued its quiet sigh. The morning light, thin and watery, usually brought a fragile sort of peace to the valley. Elara, perched at her kitchen table, traced the rim of her cooling mug. The scent of pine needles, crisp and clean, tried to assert itself through the open window. But something else clung to the air this week. A faint, metallic tang, like old pennies left too long in damp soil. Liam was already out, checking the fence line of his small pasture, a routine he'd held on to with stubborn reverence, even as the news channels buzzed with escalating anxiety. She pictured him, shoulders hunched against the early chill, his breath plumbing white against the stark blue of the Montana sky. Silas, she imagined, would be in his study, surrounded by stacks of well-worn books, perhaps gazing out at the distant, silent mountains, already seeing beyond them. A low rumble, like a distant train, had become a common visitor over the past few days, easily dismissed as the earth settling, a heavy truck on the highway, or the wind playing tricks on old timbers. But this morning, it was different. It started not as a rumble, but as a deep sigh, a sound that seemed to emanate from beneath her very bones, rising through the floorboards, making the ceramic mug tremble against the oak table. The sigh deepened, stretching, growing in intensity, until it was less a sound and more a vibration that filled her entire body. The framed photograph of her grandparents on the windowsill clattered. Then, top, a sharp, cracking noise echoed from outside, followed by a rush of air that rattled the windows violently, a primal exhalation that stole her breath. Elara gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The metallic tang in the air intensified, now laced with something acrid, sulfurous, choking. She pushed away from the table, stumbling towards the window, her mind refusing to connect the growing tremor with the images she'd seen in documentaries. Through the glass, past the swaying branches of the ponderosas, a colossal plume of white and gray steam billowed upwards, tearing through the pristine morning sky like a shroud being ripped apart. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't a cloud. It was the breath of something ancient, vast, and unmistakably awake, rising from the direction of the park, miles away, yet impossibly close in its presence. The plume climbed higher, thicker, a terrifying, silent monument reaching for the heavens. A distant, muffled boom resonated then, not sharp, but deep, resonating in her chest cavity. It was the sound of bedrock tearing, of water turning instantly to superheated gas, of the earth itself letting go. Her breath hitched in her throat, a choked sob that never found its voice. She felt a dizzying lurch, not from the earth, but from within her own stomach, as if a vital anchor had just snapped. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't speculation. The quiet hum beneath the world had just become a roar, however localized. Liam, leaning against a weathered fence post, had felt the tremor before he heard the sound. It began as a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots, a faint hum that spoke of immense subterranean power. He'd paused mid-thought, his hand resting on the rough grain of the wood, feeling the pulse of it. Then came the shriek, a whistle of escaping steam, so piercing it felt like an arrow driven through his skull. He instinctively shielded his eyes, looking towards the south, towards the heart of the national park, where the land stretched out, wild and untamed. What he saw made his blood run cold. A column of steam, not the soft, ethereal mist of a geyser, but a furious, churning tower of white and gray, erupted from the landscape, tearing through the thin blue fabric of the sky. It was impossibly fast, impossibly huge, blossoming outwards like a monstrous inverted flower. He saw trees, hundreds of them, no thousands, become mere splinters caught in its violent ascent, disappearing into the blinding white. The ground beneath him bucked, a sickening heave that threw him off balance. He landed hard on his knees, the impact jarring his teeth, his hands scraping against frozen earth. A profound sense of awe, cold and terrifying, washed over him. This was not a natural event in the way a storm was natural, or a forest fire. This was something else entirely, a raw geological scream from the planet's core. The air, suddenly thick with the smell of rotten eggs and scorched rock, burned in his lungs. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting, his eyes fixated on the towering column that continued to expand, pushing silent, turbulent clouds across the sky. His first coherent thought was of Alara, alone in the house, vulnerable. His second was of Silas, who had spoken of this possibility with a quiet certainty that had always unnerved him. The world had just delivered a warning, stark and undeniable. He turned and began to run, stumbling towards his truck, towards the house, towards the desperate hope of solid ground that no longer felt solid at all. Silas, by some strange, melancholic foresight, was already at his window, watching the distant tree line with a mournful gaze, even before the ground truly began to shudder. He had been reading an old geological survey, its pages brittle with age, detailing the caldera's ancient breaths. A faint tremor had vibrated through the glass pane, a delicate plucking of the invisible strings that bound the earth. Then the sound came, a low guttural groan, tearing itself from the planet's throat. He didn't need to turn on the news. He didn't need official confirmation. The land spoke to him, an ancient language of shift and release, of pressure and liberation. He watched the column of steam climb, a silent, monumental testament to a power beyond human comprehension. There was no panic in him, only a profound, aching sorrow. He had lived with this possibility for so long, had dreamt of it, had woven it into the tapestry of his understanding of existence. This was not the end of the world, not yet. But it was the end of a long, oblivious sleep. The air filled with a metallic tang, carried on a sudden cool breeze. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the scent of sulfur, the distant groan of the earth, the rising plume imprint themselves onto his consciousness. When he opened them again, the world outside looked both the same and irrevocably changed. The sky was still blue above the rising steam. The distant mountains still stood sentinel, but the very fabric of peace had been torn. His phone buzzed on the desk, a shrill, insistent demand for attention. He ignored it for a moment, letting the silence of his study absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. Then, with a sigh that felt older than his years, he reached for it. It was Liam, his voice tight with a raw fear. Silas rarely heard. "Did you see it, Silas? The plume?" "I did, Liam." Silas' voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. They're calling it a phreatic eruption." "A big one?" "The ranger station just broadcasted it. They're evacuating West Yellowstone." A faint, high-pitched wail of a siren began to weave its way through the valley, growing slowly, deliberately louder. It was a sound usually associated with accidents, with human error, not with the Earth's deliberate awakening. Then came the official alert, not a phone call, but an automated stentorian voice blasting from the television set Elara had just switched on, her hands visibly shaking. "This is an emergency alert system broadcast. Effective immediately. Mandatory evacuation orders are in place for all residents within a 50-mile radius of the Yellowstone caldera. This includes the towns of West Yellowstone, Gardner, Cook City, and Silver Gate. Residents are advised to proceed calmly and swiftly to designated evacuation routes." The voice was devoid of emotion, yet its very blandness amplified the terror. It repeated the message, then again, a relentless drumbeat of impending displacement. Elara stood frozen, staring at the screen, her lips parted slightly, breath catching in her throat. The words themselves seemed to hang in the air, heavy and solid, like stones. A mandatory evacuation. Not a drill. Not a suggestion. Not a drill. The quiet, persistent unease that had settled over their lives for weeks had finally found its sharp, undeniable edge. She looked at her hands, still trembling, then around her small, familiar kitchen, the sun-drenched table, the half-empty coffee mug, the photograph of her grandparents still lying on its side. Each item suddenly seemed imbued with a fragile, almost mournful significance. Liam burst through the door, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He moved straight to Elara, pulling her into a tight, desperate embrace. "We have to go, Elara," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with unshed tears. "We have to get out." His practical mind was already clicking into gear, planning routes, remembering supplies. But beneath the urgency, Elara could feel the tremor in his arms, the deep, guttural fear that had finally broken through his carefully constructed resolve. Silas arrived shortly after, his face etched with a quiet sadness that seemed to mirror the very landscape outside. He carried a worn leather satchel, a few books, and a thermos. He simply looked at them, a lifetime of understanding passing between the three of them in that silent, heavy moment. "The dream is ending, isn't it?" Elara whispered, her voice barely audible, the words feeling foreign and alien in her own mouth. Her eyes, wide and luminous with unshed tears, sought Silas's. He nodded slowly, a profound weariness settling over his features. "It seems so, Elara. He didn't offer false platitudes, didn't try to soften the blow. He simply affirmed the undeniable truth." The sound of more sirens joined the first, creating a rising chorus of urgency, painting the air with a new kind of anxiety. The whisper beneath the world was no longer a whisper. It was a statement, profound and irreversible. The thin, fragile skin of their existence had finally begun to tear. They stood there, three figures in a small kitchen, watching the news channel, listening to the sirens, the quiet thrum of their lives suddenly replaced by the drumming beat of the Earth's awakening. The process of leaving, of packing, of abandoning had begun. Not with a bang, but with a sorrowful, inevitable sigh. The morning light, filtered through the old lace curtains, usually held a soft, golden promise. Today, it felt thin and bruised. It lay across their unmade bed, a pale blanket of resignation, illuminating dust motes dancing in a slow, sad waltz. Elara traced the rough wave of the blanket with her fingertip. Her hand felt cold, even in the faint warmth of the sunbeam. Beside her, Liam stirred, a low sigh escaping his lips. He didn't open his eyes immediately, as if prolonging the fragile peace of those last waking moments in a home they would soon abandon. The air in the house was already different, anticipatory. It hummed, not with the usual comforting creaks and groans of an old dwelling, but with a silent, heavy question. Yesterday's decision, made under the oppressive weight of geological data and hushed governmental warnings, had solidified into today's terrible reality. They were leaving. Not for a holiday, not for a visit, but for good. His eyes finally fluttered open, finding hers in the dim light. There were no words, none that felt adequate anyway. Only a shared understanding, a deep, aching current that flowed between them, born of 2 decades intertwined within these walls. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent anchor. The ritual of packing was a strange, muted affair. It wasn't about efficiency or even necessity, not truly. It was about choosing fragments of a life, bits of memory, to carry forward into an unknowable future. They moved through the rooms like ghosts, touching surfaces, lingering in doorways. In the kitchen, Elara found herself staring at the chipped ceramic mug Liam had used every morning since they moved in. It depicted a cheerful sunflower, now faded by countless washes. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her hand as she lifted it. It wasn't valuable, not monetarily, but it held the ghosts of 1,000 sunrises, of conversations over steaming coffee, of quiet breakfasts before the world intruded. She placed it gently into a small box marked Essentials, a wry, bitter smile touching her lips. What were essentials, really, when the ground beneath your feet was threatening to swallow everything? The scent of stale coffee grounds still lingered near the old grinder. She wouldn't take it. No room for grinding beans where they were going. It felt like leaving a small, comforting part of their routine behind, a piece of the predictable world they had known. She chose a small, smooth river stone from the windowsill instead, one they had found together on their first picnic by the Snake River, its surface cool and reassuring against her palm. Liam, in his study, sat on the edge of his worn armchair. Dust motes still danced in the shafts of light cutting through the Venetian blinds. His gaze swept over the bookshelves, crammed with histories, philosophies, and a lifetime's worth of collected knowledge. None of it mattered now. He picked up a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his cramped handwriting, observations on the local flora, musings on the universe, nascent ideas for their garden. He held it for a long moment, the weight of it feeling immense in his hand. It was a record of a mind at peace, observing a world that was now withdrawing its welcome. This he would take. He also chose a small wooden carving of an owl, intricately detailed, which his grandfather had made. It represented wisdom, he thought, a quality they would desperately need. A faint whisper of anger brushed against his grief. Anger at the silent, indifferent force that was displacing them, at the cosmic joke of human insignificance. He pushed it down, the way he pushed down most things. He always had been the quiet one, the sturdy trunk to Elara's flowing branches. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound in the stillness. They converged in the living room, the heart of their home. The space felt hollowed out, its furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering giants. It was here, by the old stone fireplace, that they had spent countless evenings, reading, talking, simply existing in each other's quiet company. Elara knelt by the hearth, running her fingers over the cold, rough stone. She remembered the warmth, the crackle of logs, the scent of wood smoke clinging to their clothes. Liam joined her, his large hand settling gently on her shoulder. He picked up a small, slightly tarnished silver frame from the mantelpiece. It held a photograph of them, younger, laughing, standing on the rim of the caldera years ago. The sun was bright, the sky an impossible blue, and the steam rising from the hot springs behind them had seemed like a whimsical natural phenomenon, not a premonition. He pocketed it without a word. They needed no reminder of what they were leaving, but perhaps a reminder of what they once were, what they had. The heaviest farewell was to the garden. It had been Elara's sanctuary, a riot of carefully tended life. The roses, their petals still dewy, nodded gently in the morning breeze. The scent of lavender and damp earth hung in the air, rich and bittersweet. She moved amongst the plants, touching a vibrant fuchsia, stroking the velvety leaves of a sage bush. Each plant was a memory, a season, a quiet triumph. She bent down, gently digging a small sprig of rosemary from the soil. Its pungent aroma filled her nostrils, sharp and clean, a fleeting connection to the earth she was abandoning. This was a fragment she could not leave behind, a small living piece of their rootedness. Liam watched her, a tightness in his chest. He knew what this garden meant to her, more than just flowers and herbs. It was a testament to patience, to growth, to the belief in cycles and renewal. To leave it felt like severing a limb. He knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against the cool soil. "It will be okay," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She didn't respond, only pressed the rosemary sprig to her lips. A silent kiss, goodbye to a vibrant, breathing world. Their packed car was a stark contrast to the life they were leaving behind. A few boxes, a duffel bag each, the small ceramic mug carefully wrapped, the journal, the wooden owl, the river stone, the sprig of rosemary now nestled in a damp cloth. It felt impossibly light, yet also unbearably heavy. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble, a sound that usually signified adventure, a new beginning. Today, it was the sound of an ending. Liam gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Elara looked back at the house, a sudden, sharp pang piercing her. The front door stood slightly ajar, a gesture of abandonment, a silent invitation to the emptiness that would soon fill its rooms. The porch swing, where they'd shared so many quiet evenings, gently swayed in the breeze. The rose bushes, now vibrant and alive, would soon be consumed by something ancient and unforgiving. She thought of the stories of Pompeii, of ordinary lives frozen in ash, and a shiver ran down her spine. But this was different. This was a slow, sorrowful exhalation, a world sighing itself into oblivion. Liam put the car in reverse, slowly backing down the gravel driveway. The crunching sound felt like footsteps on broken glass. She didn't wave. There was no one to wave to. Only the house, standing sentinel, shrinking in the rearview mirror. They were leaving not just a place, but a dream of continuity, of belonging, of a future carved from the quiet certainties of daily life. The road stretched ahead, winding through the familiar landscape, a landscape that now felt borrowed, temporary. The pines whispered their ancient secrets, a sound that seemed to follow them, a soft, melancholic hum. Beneath the tires, beneath the very fabric of the world, she could almost feel it. The deep, slow rhythm faltering, then changing into something else entirely. A sorrowful, inevitable sigh. They were just two small figures, driving away from the ghost of a world into the vast, uncertain expanse of what remained. The silence in the car was profound, broken only by the hum of the engine and the beating of their own fragile heart. They carried their memories, their love, and a few small, precious things, and the quiet despair that clung to them like dust motes in the mournful light. The kettle had just begun its soft, tremulous whistle when the light shifted. Not a sudden flick of a switch, nor the abrupt dark of a storm front, but something far more subtle, as if the very air had thickened, taking on a bruised, purpling hue. Ilara paused, her hand hovering over the ceramic mug, the heat from the stovetop, a familiar comfort against the chill of the morning. She moved to the window, pushing aside the faded lace curtain, and peered out. The world outside was usually awash in the gentle gold of late spring, the new leaves on the maple tree, a vibrant, almost audacious green. Today, however, the green seemed muted, as if seen through a veil of ancient grief. A tremor, so faint it could have been her own heart skipping a beat, pulsed through the floorboards. It was not the sharp jolt of a distant quake, but a slow, deep vibration, like the resonating hum of an immense bell struck far, far away. She remembered her grandmother, long gone now, speaking of the earth's pulse, how some places had a stronger beat than others. Yellowstone, her grandmother had always said, was the earth's own dreaming heart. Now that heart was not dreaming, it was sighing. The first tendrils of what she knew, deep in her bones was coming, began to stretch across the sky. They were not the angry boiling clouds of an ordinary storm. No, these were softer, more pervasive, like wisps of forgotten thought unspooling from the horizon, blotting out the crisp definition of the distant mountains. It began with a pale gray, staining the impossibly blue canvas of the morning sky. Then, a deeper charcoal, bleeding from the west, spreading with an unnerving, almost leisurely pace. There was no roar, no explosive clap to split the air. Only this profound, ever-deepening quietude, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Ilara found herself whispering, a sound barely audible even to her own ears. "Oh, old friend," she murmured, her fingers pressing against the cool glass of the windowpane. "You're waking." The light continued to fade, not into night, but into a permanent twilight, an endless dusk that swallowed the familiar colors of her small garden. The bright reds of the geraniums on her porch, the vivid yellow of the dandelions pushing through the cracks in the flagstones, all began to recede, washed out by the encroaching monochrome. She watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the first flakes began to fall. Not snow. Never snow. These were fine, impossibly soft particles, like powdered moonlight drifting down from the bruised heavens. They settled on the maple leaves, turning them a ghostly white. They dusted the porch railing, transforming the rough wood into something smooth and ethereal. She pushed open the window, allowing the strange new air to fill her small cottage. It carried no smell of sulfur or fire, no acrid stench of destruction. Instead, it was a scent of damp earth and ancient stone, of something deeply buried now exhumed, cold and vast. A whisper of dust. It landed on her outstretched palm, a microscopic constellation of gray. It felt like nothing, yet everything. It was the breath of the mountain, a sorrowful exhalation, a slow, inevitable release, a shiver not of cold, but of profound understanding, traced its way down her spine. This wasn't an act of violence, she realized. It was an act of profound, cosmic sadness. The earth, in its deep slumber, had finally sighed itself awake, and that sigh was made of ash. Hours blurred into an eternity, marked only by the steadily worsening gloom. The air grew thick, particulate, catching in the back of her throat with a dry mineral taste. She closed the window, but the ash found its way in, sifting under the sill, tracing delicate patterns on her dark wooden table. It was a relentless, silent invasion, polite in its persistence. The world outside became a canvas of gray on gray, the familiar silhouettes of trees and distant houses, softening, blurring, then disappearing altogether. The streetlights, which usually flickered on at true dusk, remained off, their lamps obscured by the dense particulate blanket. Electricity, she knew, would be one of the first things to surrender. She lit an old oil lamp, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the growing darkness outside. The air inside the cottage, even with windows sealed, was heavy with the fine dust. She ran a finger along the top of an old photo frame, leaving a clean streak in the settling ash. It was a picture of her parents, smiling broadly in the summer sun, their faces innocent of the knowledge of days like these. Their world had been built on such certainties, such fragile, green assurances. Now the sky was a permanent twilight, a vast, unbroken bruise of charcoal and lead. The gentle, whispering fall of ash continued, a soft, ceaseless rain of dissolution. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or the quiet rustle of forgotten memories. She remembered stories from childhood, tales of a sunless sky, of a world plunged into an endless winter. They had always been stories, warnings perhaps, whispered around crackling campfires. Now, the stories had found their way out of the shadows, walking among them in a gray shroud. A deep aching sadness settled in her chest, not for herself, not immediately, but for the sheer magnificent indifference of it all. The earth, in its grand geological timeline, cared nothing for the delicate spun webs of human lives. It simply breathed. And its breath reshaped everything. She watched a moth, drawn by the lamplight, flutter against the window pane, its fragile wings stirring tiny motes of ash into swirling galaxies on the glass. It was a small, desperate dance in a world that was rapidly turning monochrome. The silence outside was profound now, broken only by the continuous, almost imperceptible sigh of the falling ash. No birds sang, no distant traffic hummed, only the soft, insistent whisper of the world being remade. Alara pulled a wool blanket around her shoulders, its familiar weight a small comfort against the chilling truth that now filled the air. The ash winter had come, not with a bang, but with a sorrowful, drawn-out exhalation, painting the world in shades of gray, and ushering in an age of inescapable, quiet darkness. She closed her eyes, but the grayness had already seeped behind her eyelids, a permanent imprint on her soul. The dreaming heart of the earth had awakened, and its first utterance was a sigh so vast it had swallowed the sun. The air tasted like grit and old sorrow. Alara drew a shallow breath through the scarf, wrapped tight around her face, the rough wool catching on the dry, cracked skin of her lips. Each inhale was a calculated risk, a gamble against the microscopic shards of earth that now drifted with an eternal, silent grace. The sky, when they could see it, was a bruised, opaque bruise. No sun, no stars, just a uniform. Endless gray that swallowed the horizon whole. Liam scraped his boot against the porch step of what had once been a cozy, mint-green bungalow, now an ash-dusted tomb. The sound was like sandpaper on bone, thin and weary. He carried the plastic jerry can, mostly empty, slung over his shoulder, a ghost of his former easy strength in his slumped posture. "Nothing," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, muffled by his own improvised mask. Silas perched on a fallen tree branch that was more ash sculpture than wood, merely nodded. His eyes, deep and knowing, held the ancient weariness of the earth itself. He wasn't searching for anything tangible anymore. He was listening, perhaps, to the new rhythm of the world, or the echo of the old. Elara watched them, a dull ache settling in her chest, heavy as the ash that coated everything. It wasn't just the lack of water that gnawed at her, or the constant rasping cough that seemed to have taken root in her lungs. It was the quiet, the profound, absolute quiet. The world used to hum with 1,000 insignificant sounds. The distant drone of traffic, the chirping of sparrows, the laughter of children skipping rope on sun-drenched sidewalks. Now, only the wind whispered, a dry, abrasive sound against the barren landscape, stirring the ash into slow, mournful drift. She remembered the mornings before, the insistent clang of her alarm, the scent of fresh coffee blooming in her small apartment, the frantic scramble for her car keys. Such trivial concerns they seemed now, so impossibly far away, like scenes from a forgotten dream. A memory flickered, bright and painful, of a summer evening, laughing with friends on a patio, the air thick with the smell of barbecue and blooming jasmine. She could almost taste the crispness of a chilled glass of white wine, hear the easy chatter, feel the warmth of a hand brushing hers. It was a ghost, a phantom limb of a life that had been severed without warning. Liam walked towards her, his movements heavy, leaving deeper imprints in the thick carpet of ash. "We should try the old reservoir," he said, his gaze fixed on the indistinguishable horizon. "It might still have something, if the filtration system holds." His practicality was a lifeline, a blunt anchor in the swirling chaos. Elara didn't respond immediately. Her fingers traced a pattern in the ash on a broken windowsill, a spiraling design, like a nebula collapsing inward. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Liam stopped, a slight tremor in his broad shoulders. He remembered every detail. The vibrant yellow of her dress, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the sudden fierce spark in her eyes when she argued with him about something utterly inconsequential. He remembered the feeling of possibility, the rush of adrenaline. Now the only rush was the grim race against thirst and the creeping cold. "It was at the farmer's market," he said, his voice softer now, a rare gift. "You were haggling over a bunch of organic carrots." A faint, sad smile touched Elara's lips, barely visible beneath the scarf. "I thought you were arrogant. I thought you were stubborn," Liam countered, a flicker of something like humor in his eyes, quickly extinguished. Silas cleared his throat, a dry rasp. "Those carrots," he said, his voice surprisingly clear. "They were very good carrots." A fragile bubble of shared remembrance hung in the ash-laden air, a momentary reprieve from the bleakness. It burst. The reality of their situation crashed down again, heavier than before. They were three strangers, bound by circumstance, surviving on the scraps of a world that no longer recognized itself. Their past lives, their dreams, their ambitions, all reduced to ash, scattered like dust. What was once important felt utterly meaningless. The looming deadline at work, the argument with a friend over a petty misunderstanding, the carefully planned vacation, all dissolved into nothing. Survival was the only currency now, measured in gulps of precious water and the fading warmth of a scavenged blanket. "We need to move," Liam said, his tone firm, pulling them back from the precipice of memory. He was the practical one, the one who saw the immediate next step, the one who fought against the encroaching despair with sheer dogged will. Ilara pushed herself away from the windowsill. Her legs felt heavy, as if the ash had seeped into her bones. She looked at Silas, who was slowly standing, dusting the gray powder from his threadbare coat. "Do you think there's anyone else?" she whispered, the question a fragile hope, a dangerous thought. Silas looked out at the endless gray, his gaze unfocused. "Perhaps," he said, his voice a low hum. "Or perhaps this is simply how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a prolonged, agonizing exhale." His words, though bleak, carried a strange, somber comfort, a sense of acceptance, perhaps, that transcended their personal suffering. They walked, slowly, deliberately, the crunch of their boots on ash, the only sound. The world stretched out before them, a canvas of desolation. Every building they passed was a skeletal reminder of a vibrant past. A storefront with a faded advertisement for gourmet coffee, a children's playground, swings frozen mid-arc, buried in volcanic dust. A parked car, once sleek and gleaming, now a dull gray mound, its windows opaque with ash. Ilara found herself cataloging them, not with a sense of loss, but with a detached anthropological curiosity. These were artifacts now, remnants of a forgotten civilization. The thought was unsettling, yet it offered a strange freedom. The burden of identity, of who she used to be, was lifting. She was no longer Ilara, the architect, or Ilara, the aspiring painter. She was simply Ilara, a breathing, struggling, thinking entity in a world stripped bare. Liam stopped by a gas station, or what remained of it. The sign was half buried, its cheerful red letters muted by ash. He peered into the dark, cavernous space where the convenience store used to be. "Anything useful?" Ilara asked, her voice hoarse. He shook his head, a plume of dust rising from his scarf. "Just empty shelves." They picked it clean. It was a constant loop, this search for sustenance, for shelter, for a sign of life. A brutal rhythm that replaced the old cadence of appointments and deadlines. Silas knelt, his fingers sifting through a patch of ash near a collapsed wall. He held up a small, smooth river stone, gray and unremarkable. "Look," he said, his voice soft. "It was here before. It will be here after." His words were a quiet prayer, a reminder of the enduring, indifferent patience of the earth itself. Ilara took the stone, its coolness a fleeting comfort in her palm. It was smooth, worn by countless currents, untouched by the recent cataclysm. It held a silent history, a truth beyond human folly. She closed her fist around it, feeling its solidity, its timeless presence. This was their new reality. Stripped of everything, they were left with the raw, elemental struggle. The search for water, for food, for a safe place to rest their aching bodies. But amidst this starkness, a different kind of life began to stir. A realization. Their past fears, their anxieties, their striving for success or material wealth. They were phantoms. Their worth was no longer tied to their possessions or their careers. It was in each shared glance, each murmured word of encouragement, each act of quiet solidarity. Liam, despite his weariness, would check on Alara and Silas constantly. Silas, despite his philosophical detachment, would share the last bite of a scavenged energy bar. Alara, despite her grief, would point out a distant faint shimmer that might be water, a tiny beacon of hope. They were becoming something new, forged in the crucible of desolation. Their purpose was no longer grand or individualistic. It was simple: to endure, to witness, to remember. As the gray light began to fade, not into night, but into a deeper, heavier shade of twilight, they found a small, partially intact shed behind a ruined farmhouse. It was crude, drafty, but offered a modicum of shelter from the constant, sifting ash. Inside, Liam found a torn tarp and spread it on the ground. Silas, with slow, deliberate movements, arranged some broken planks to block a gap in the wall. Alara sat on an upturned crate, watching them, her breath clouding in the cold air. She pulled the smooth river stone from her pocket and held it. It was small, insignificant, yet it felt like the most precious thing she owned. "We'll find water tomorrow," Liam said, his voice a promise, a quiet act of defiance against the overwhelming odds. Alara looked at him, then at Silas, whose eyes were now closed, his face etched with a profound serenity. She envied. She didn't know if they would. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for now, in the stillness of the ash-filled world, under a sky that had forgotten the sun, there was a faint, stubborn flicker, a determination not born of anger or rebellion, but of a quiet, weary resolve. A purpose etched not in grand designs, but in the simple, shared act of breathing, of enduring together. The silence pressed in around them, a heavy shroud. But within that silence, a new, fragile whisper began to stir. The whisper of life, refusing to be extinguished, undefined. The wind, when it came, was a sigh. It carried not the scent of pine or damp soil, but a fine, almost imperceptible dust that settled on Alara's worn jacket, a ghost of the past. Years had softened the edges of the immediate horror, but the memory, like the ash beneath her feet, remained deep and pervasive. She sat on a makeshift bench fashioned from a fallen, petrified log, overlooking what had once been a valley teeming with life, now a vast, gray canvas, subtly interrupted by emerging greens. The silence here was different from the silence of old forests, a vast and watchful quiet that spoke of immense power, recently unleashed and now merely dormant. Her fingers traced the rough grain of the stone-like wood, cool beneath her touch. It was late afternoon. The sun, filtered by the permanent haze in the upper atmosphere, casting a diffused, pearlescent light that rendered the world in shades of muted silver and muted sage. The air itself felt thin, imbued with an ancient memory. She closed her eyes, letting the stillness seep into her bones. This was her new church, this scarred landscape, demanding a reverence born not of fear, but of profound understanding. No roaring sermons, just the ceaseless, patient work of the earth. When she opened them again, her gaze fell upon a small, determined patch of moss clinging to a rock face near the base of the ridge. It was a brilliant, almost defiant emerald against the monochromatic backdrop. How many winters had passed since the sky first bled ash? How many seasons had thawed and refrozen the vast silent layers? She didn't count anymore. Not precisely. The concept of linear time had blurred, stretched thin by the cataclysm, replaced by cycles of regrowth, of patient waiting. Her own hair, once dark, now held threads of silver that caught the soft, diffused light, like the moss, a testament to time. The old world felt like a forgotten dream, distant and impossible. She remembered the sharp scent of morning coffee, the insistent hum of traffic, the casual ease of a grocery store aisle filled with plastic-wrapped abundance. Such fleeting, delicate things they were. The whisper of it all, that immense, slumbering presence beneath their feet, had grown louder, then impossibly loud, until it was the only sound. And then silence again, but a silence that tasted of sulfur and grief. For a long time, the world had been only that. Ash and silence. The sky perpetually bruised. The sun a ghost. Survival had been a stark, brutal lesson. Every grain of rice, every drop of clean water, a victory. They had learned to hoard, to share, to build again with what little remained. Villages had sprung up in forgotten hollows, connected by muddy paths, not highways. Humanity had shrunk, not in stature, but in its footprint, retreating into small, tenacious knots of warmth against the vast, cold indifference. But something else had also grown, something unexpected, a profound quietude, a forced introspection. With the incessant clamor of the old world gone, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of their own footsteps on the ash, people had started to listen differently. To themselves, to each other, to the land. Elara listened now, not just with her ears, but with her whole being. The faint scuttle of a beetle beneath the ash, the distant, reedy cry of a hawk, a sound that years ago would have been drowned by 1,000 other noises. The rustle of new, brittle leaves on a sapling, pushing through the gray crust. The earth was breathing again, slowly, painstakingly. She thought of the stories passed down, ancient whispers of creation and destruction, tales of goddesses and giants shaping mountains with their sorrow or their rage. They had always felt like quaint fictions in the bright, clinical light of modern science. Now, they felt like profound truths. The earth was not merely a rock spinning in space, but a living, breathing entity with its own vast, unknowable cycles of sleep and awakening. And they, humanity, were merely guests, transient visitors, their bustling cities and clever inventions no more significant than the transient frost on a winter windowpane. Yet, there was beauty in this stark acceptance. A melancholic peace had settled over her, not a resignation, but an understanding. The world had ended, yes, but life had not. Life, in its stubborn, quiet way, had insisted on continuing. She watched a small, hesitant stream carve a fresh path through the ash, the water clear and cold, carrying tiny particles downstream. It was a new artery, pulsing with the promise of unseen springs. Sometimes, at night, when the moon cast stark shadows across the ash fields, she would lie awake and remember the tremor, the deep, guttural growl that had preceded the sky's fury. It was a visceral memory, one that still tightened her chest, a phantom echo in her bones. But those moments of dread were fewer now. They were slowly replaced by observations of quiet triumphs, the first tentative blossoms on an ash-resistant shrub, the sight of children, born after the great sleep, their laughter echoing across the vast emptiness, completely unaware of the world that had been. They knew only this: the quiet, the hard work, the communal warmth. They saw the gray, but they sought the green. Elara reached down and gently touched a small fledgling fern, its fronds unfurling with slow, almost imperceptible grace from the ash. It was fragile, yes, but imbued with an ancient strength. It remembered, It knew how to push. It knew how to endure. And so, she realized, did they. Humanity, too, was a fern, pushing through the ash, scarred but unbroken. They had shed so much, the superficial, the extraneous, the illusions of control. What remained was raw, resilient, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the earth itself. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in hues of bruised violet and faint gold, a slow, gentle transition that mirrored the world's own transformation. A silent promise, not of a return to what was, but of a quiet, hard-won future. Alara rose from her makeshift bench, her muscles stiff, but her spirit settled. She began the long, quiet walk back to the cluster of humble dwellings in the hollow, leaving footprints in the ash, each one a testament to persistence, a whisper of hope in a world forever changed. The wind sighed again, carrying the faint, clean scent of new life.